So we are going. So I'm so happy to introduce our first speaker tonight, Tim Ingalsbee. Tim started his fire career as a wildland firefighter for both the U.S. Forest Service and National Park Service, and is now a certified senior wildland fire ecologist. He earned his PhD in environmental sociology with a graduate certificate in nonprofit management from the University of Oregon, where he is also an adjunct instructor and faculty research associate. He was named Oregon's Conservationist of the Year in 1993. Tim is the executive director of FUSE, Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics and Ecology. FUSE strives to inform and empower fire management workers and their citizen supporters to become torchbearers for ecological fire management. Wildfire is not our enemy and need not be a crisis or a catastrophe. FUSE works to promote safe, ethical, ecological wildland fire management. Okay, Tim, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Right. I'll screen share. Yeah. So, thank you. It's a real delight to be here. I have so much admiration and affection for the Crag Law Center, not only because they have been, champions of my daughter's lawsuit, but Ralph and I go way back in defending post-fire burned forests, particularly in Eastern Oregon. So it's really a pleasure to be here to share with you with some slightly depressing news. You call it suppression, confession, depression. That really, we've put so many chips in the basket of reactive emergency wildfire suppression. And as I think recent events demonstrated, there's much futility and sadly even fatality in that strategy of fighting against all wildland fires. We're all living in the fire zone, even those of us not immediately within the reach of flames. We got inundated with the smoke for weeks. Truly phenomenal rates of spread. These outlines of fires, that was a spread just within 48 hours. Instant blow-ups, and there was just nothing and nobody able to stop them. They were marching all the way down to the valley. Thousands of homes, several people died in their path. But it was really an extremely rare event, not entirely unnatural in our geologic past. Events in our future, and so we're all living in that fire zone now. Ironically, I'm speaking from our headquarters in Eugene, Oregon, the heart of the Kalapuya territory. They inhabited the Willamette Valley and surrounding foothills for thousands of years, and over that time period, they survived periods of natural climate variability, warm periods, droughts, whatever. But they did not have fleets of air tankers and engines and thousands of tool-wielding firefighters. They lived in a fire environment by working with fire. It helped them live with fire. And some anthropologists even consider the Kalapuya to have a pyroculture because it was such an intimate part of their way of life. They used it in very, strategic, selective, careful ways, sometimes burning 3 times a year in different places for different purposes. And over that great span of time, much of the native flora and fauna co-evolved with native fires. In fact, much of our native forests need native fires as part of the sustaining their integrity. So what I bring this up is that, though I'm going to talk about the limits of wildland firefighting and fire suppression, the period of fire exclusion predates the period of fire suppression by the cessation of Kalapuya burning here in the Willamette Valley. So there's a problem as much with the fires we failed to put in, as well as the fires we fought to put out. I'll bring that to more. But at the turn of the last century, with the creation of the Forest Service, it really struggled to teach people this new concept of forest conservation. What does it mean? How do you do it? And they sold it to the public through the guise of firefighting. Excluding all fires, we'll be able to grow and harvest more trees. Well, in the early days of firefighting, in the upper left-hand corner, lone fire watch with a flame swatter, minimally effective. You're only able to put out those fires that are burning at the lowest intensity with the cool, moist conditions. Not very effective. In the 1930s, with the advent of the Civilian Conservation Corps, we had our nation's first large standing firefighting crews. And that increased the capacity for successful firefighting. But when you're wielding a bunch of misery whips and hose, then too, you're still limited in your effectiveness. It wasn't until just after World War II, and particularly after the Korean War ended, that we started mechanizing fire suppression and bringing a lot of military surplus and vehicles and equipment. This photo on the right is a staged photo showing the Forest Service throwing everything they have at a fire: dozers, jeeps, engines, mule trains. Even the helicopter, just past the helicopter, is a smoke jumper. And I don't know how many, hopefully this is a one-take photo. Get it right the first time, or else that poor guy is jumping in repeatedly to catch that photo. But anyway, it wasn't until the post-World War II era that it was effective. And this is our kind of modern fantasy. Firefighting is the moral equivalent of war. We're fighting fires, we're battling blazes, but it's just this endless and escalating war on wildfire. And when we apply the war metaphor to fire management, it's not a good thing. Even though, when I was 20 something and in it, I was kind of ate up with that identity of being an eco warrior out there defending public lands and protecting forests. Turning fire crews into soldiers rather than land stewards, or warriors rather than workers, it has adverse consequences for both society and nature. And the reality is, the 21st century climate we're experiencing is rapidly ending the efficacy of 20th century firefighting strategies and models. This is more the reality, particularly in California. Crews having to run away from flames, get out of the path of fire spread. The conditions are just not humanly possible to stop fires and put them out. But it brings to mind, if you framed our relationship with fire as fire is the enemy, we must battle and we must fight, you're essentially fighting against nature. And in that framing of forever fighting against nature, well, we're damned if we lose, and we are losing. We're also damned if we win. I mean, what does that mean to win the fight and conquer and control nature? It's a bad frame here. So we were reasonably effective in the post-war period on up till about the late 1980s. And it wasn't just because we started mechanized suppression and have the crews and employing science and all that. It was as much about the climate. We were in a cool, moist climatic conditions through much of the West. Part of natural climate variability in cycles we refer as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And you can see in this bar graph, the number of acres of fire burning was fairly high at the early part of last century. And then those 3 decades from about the 1950s to the late 1980s, the number of acres went down. And that coincided with mechanizing fire suppression. It coincided with building lots of logging roads and logging in the national forest, and another real surge in fire suppression that kind of lulled us into this false sense of victory, if you will. And the numbers of acres burned annually crash from upwards of 30 million acres on average per year to barely 3 million acres. Well, when that cool, moist period, we shifted out of it. Now do we enter another natural cycle of warmer, drier climate. it's been accelerated with climate change, anthropogenic fossil fuel climate change. So not only has the period of fire exclusion been on for well over a century and a half, the period of effective fire suppression was really limited to about 3 decades in the post-war era. That's all over. We're just rapidly ending this ability to successfully fight fires. Well, what's happening is climate change is fueling these megafires, large fires driven by hot, dry, windy conditions. And research has demonstrated that in excess of 96% of all those disastrous urban wildfires occur during red flag severe fire weather conditions. And in my mind, whenever the weather report says it's a red flag warning, in all our minds, you should think, oh, tornado watch or hurricane watch or warning. Because that's when fires, if ignited, can spread and can't be stopped. And that includes what's been happening in California, just successive record-breaking heat waves, dry fuels, and what happened here over the Labor Day weekend, what I'm dubbing the Western Oregon East Wind Firestorm event, supreme red flag warnings. What happens is these fires are growing so big because they're driven by embers that fly, a mile or two ahead of the flame front, and they land on super dry fuels and they ignite a new fire. So it's like these blizzards of embers more than these tsunamis of flames that are rolling across the landscape and causing fires to kind of hopscotch across the land, bounce from ridgetop to ridgetop. They leapfrog across fire lines and fuel breaks. Firefighters can't cut fire line to stop embers. And case in point is during the Eagle Creek fire in the gorge, an ember lofted over the Columbia River, landed in Washington State, and started a new fire. And I tell you, there's no fire line the crews can build that is bigger or better than the Columbia River. And these are the conditions that are happening. And so what's happening is we're not able to aggressively, directly, fight fires. Firefighters are backing off and burning out, waiting for a change in the weather before they can really engage in suppression. And we're in a paradox in that, we're being forced to attempt to be more aggressive. But this is becoming vastly more risky for firefighters, much more expensive for taxpayers, billions of dollars spent every year, much of it in futility, more damaging to the ecosystem, and we're getting less effective. And what scientists have determined is that these large wildfires typically define their own perimeters. They're fueled by these red flag weather conditions, and they make these large runs, and then those weather conditions change and they rest. It's during these quiescent periods of low or moderate weather conditions that allows firefighters to kind of get around engaged. So it's like the Lilliputians. They conquered Gulliver. Yeah, well, no, they were able to pin him down when he lay down and went to sleep, and that's much of what's really happening with fire suppression of these large fires. They're becoming much more frequent due to climate change. So here's everyone's fantasy who lives in the rural West, is that in case of fire, there will be engines and crews parked in your driveway, air tankers, zooming in the backyard, and your home will be protected and defended. Well, it's possible that this home was saved, but it's got so many conditions that line up to make it this probably was another staged photo. These power lines in the back really make me on edge. It's perched on the top of a steep slope covered with flammable brush. And those flames are so high, there's no really stopping those kind of flames, not even with engines or air tankers. So this is the fantasy. The reality is that a single wildfire can threaten hundreds of homes simultaneously, just overwhelming. And especially during red flag conditions, the firefighters are not able to stop that spread. And once a fire enters into an urban area, it kind of transitions from a wildfire into an urban fire, sets up house-to-house ignitions and a chain reaction. and there's just tragedy and catastrophe ensues. So we discovered really that homes are much more flammable than forests. And like how fires spread, large fires in forests, by embers, that's how they enter and ignite homes, by ember, small surface flames, landing on mats of dead needles on the rooftop or getting sucked into roof vents. I took this photo standing in the Mackenzie Highway, paved asphalt. In the background is the Mackenzie River. Not 50 feet, it spans that distance, and this home sandwiched between the two, completely destroyed, and no firefighters could improve on an asphalt highway or a rolling cold river to contain a fire. This home was succumbed by embers, and you see the trees around it are still fairly green, scorched but still alive. So we got to shift to preparing for fires, especially those we can't prevent and cannot stop. And so this has become the dominant image in the news media of wildfire, burning homes, incinerated communities. And I'm just questioning, is this really a wildfire or is it an urban fire? And in an urban fire, wildland firefighting has even less effectiveness, a limited role. This retardant drop in Phoenix, Oregon, I mean, it laid on the road, which is already non-flammable, it really had minimal impact. Didn't save any of those homes. And so I think we need to distinguish between wildfires that are in wild lands, that are a vital ecological process, from what you might call WUI fires in the wildland urban interface, that are just really almost uniformly destructive events. Large wildfires are inevitable, but home losses and urban fire disasters are entirely avoidable. And I think Ralph will mention how to avoid them. So what about those large wildfires in wildlands? What's going on? Well, this little graph from the National Climate Assessment demonstrates that dark maroon brown band at the bottom, that's the portion of these large fires that burn to high severity. Vast majority burn at very moderate or low severity or entirely unburned, giant unburned islands within fire perimeters. Somehow our forests and our wildlands are far more resilient and actually have, beneficial, outcomes from much of these big megafires, unlike when they enter and transition to urban fires and they're uniformly destructive. So I want to just say, don't worry so much at this moment about all those millions of acres of wildland, backcountry area on fire. Possibly good things happen. And so if we're really becoming more and more futile in fighting fires, what's the alternative? And the alternative is ecological fire management, is letting go of that imperial model of controlling and conquering nature, fighting against fires, making war on wildfire. Instead, maybe rediscover the indigenous model of working with fire in ways that maximize the social and ecological benefits of burning, mitigate the risk and hazards of people and property, minimize the cost to taxpayers, and minimize the impacts of running bulldozers, scraping soil down to bedrock, just very damaging. Actively managing fires like they were prescribed fires, and having all your plans in place, and it's really managing for social and ecological benefits, as opposed to just managing against all risks. And this is another talk at another time, but counterintuitively, more fire, not less, is really the key to storing the most carbon in forests over the long term and stabilizing forests and watersheds for the unfolding climate change we're seeing. And so I want to end with this message. Climate change is the burning issue of our time. Wildfires are a symptom, not a source of climate change. It's fossil fuel burning. It's really poisoning the planet. It must end sooner rather than later. And forests are a big part in solving the climate crisis, whether a role in sequestering, storing carbon. Fire is a big part of solving the wildfire crisis, at least in terms of managing wildlands, maintaining natural fuel loads that will lessen some of the pressure of wildfires transitioning to urban fires. Needed to stop fighting all wildland fires, start managing every fire in ways that minimize the harm, maximize the benefits, and shift from this imperial model of the last century to the indigenous model that predated that and really represents the vast span of our species' existence and relationship with wildland fire. So our motto: the sooner we prepare our homes and communities for fire, the sooner we can restore ecosystems with fire. And on that note, thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it. And I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards, but right now I would like to turn over to my Dutch bro, Ralph.
Thanks, Tim. All right, I'm going to just jump right into it. And like Tim said, we're trying to make sure we save quite a bit of time for Q&A. And Courtney will be monitoring the chat and identifying questions to ask us. So I'm going to likewise share my screen and get going. So 3 years ago, we had the Eagle Creek fire, and Tim mentioned some of that. And I'd like to begin with that. We had 25-mile-an-hour winds. We had an ignition, someone throwing basically a rolling flamethrower known as a smoke bomb down into the canyon. And a fire started, and it ripped towards Portland, towards Troutdale, and it moved quite a distance in 25-mile-an-hour winds. And luckily, the winds died down. The fire hung out for a little bit, and then they shifted direction and drove the fire to Hood River. If we would have had many more days of wind like we just had, we would have had quite a different situation than just this fire burning in an area where there was very few homes. Yes, folks in Dodson, Warrendale, and Cascade Locks had to evacuate. But for me, that fire was really striking in that it could have easily kept moving into Corbett, Troutdale, Gresham, and become quite a bit of different scene, really all depending on the wind. Now, Congressman Greg Walden, after the fire, this is what he had to say.
Burn 48,000 acres. If there isn't a more destructive clear cut than that, I don't know what it is.
So you have a lot of demonization of fire. It runs deep. Fire destroys the forest. So he basically said the fire was worse than a 48,000 acre clear cut. He used 48,000 acres because that was the perimeter of the Eagle Creek fire. And so I want to take you within the perimeter of the Eagle Creek fire. And what I've spent the last 3 years doing is wildlife camera trapping and time-lapse photography. And what we saw from the air initially was a mosaic burn. And you saw this primarily on the ridge tops and in other areas. And it's just a vital process, and it was quite healthy for this forest. In these forest types, you will have a big fire every 150 to maybe 250 or 400 years. And some of the trees will burn, and some of them will scorch but not die. And it all just kind of varies across the landscape. In 2 years, boom, it comes back. This is a before and after, and I have hundreds of locations like this throughout the gorge that I've matched. And this one is time lapse of what it looks like over a 2.5-ish year period, starting into year one. And you see a lot of the shrubs and ground vegetation come back. And then you're heading into fall, and then winter time. And then here's the next season coming, season 2, and it kind of overwhelms the camera. So I've done that in a bunch of locations, and I intend to work to do that in some locations in the recent fires. But this is in a fire 10 years ago on the north side of Mount Hood. It was a stand replacing, in other words, hot fire that killed all the trees across pretty much 16,000 acres. And you find some amazing things. And we're having more of these landscapes. So we have to look for the beauty in them, but we don't have to look too hard. There's bees buzzing around, there's woodpeckers, there's all kinds of life. And I've documented extensive use of this area of elk, cougar, bear, deer, of course, and bobcat and other things. This is a cougar I picked up on one of my cameras in the gorge that was there about a day before I was there, maybe a little bit less than a day. And this is a bear. This took me a couple years to get this shot. And it's pretty windy and noisy there. So they love the browse. They love to eat the young flowering plants. I've gotten lots of video of them eating the fireweed and the tiger lilies, and there's lots of things to hunt. So this is what you get. You get a young forest coming back within the charcoal forest. So we're going to have quite a bit of that in Opal Creek and around Brighton Bush and a lot of other places we love. Speaking of Opal Creek, yesterday a friend of mine flew into Opal Creek and took some photos. And so I was going to share that for you. This is Battle Axe, which is a very old forest, barely touched by fire. Other areas adjacent, totally stand replacing, but some mosaic. Really hard for the staff that is working there to see this. That's Megan with Opal Creek Ancient Forest Center. And some of their bridges were damaged on the way in. They lost, almost every structure but one cabin. And so I think that, a lot of these things, it's hard to see, right? It's hard to see because it changes as we know it, as we experience it. So there is a loss, right? As much as we can understand that it's part of a larger cycle, we live in our lifetimes, in our lived experience. While time lapse and wildlife can give us some hope, the impact really is sort of greatest on our relationship with the places we know, including our homes and our communities. So they kind of lost everything. So they have a big rebuilding effort, but their future is going to be post-fire education. That's what it's going to be. And there's their main cabin and a few other things. And no, this has not been released yet publicly, but I just put this together for tonight so you all could see a place that and what it looks like. Opal Pool, still very clear and beautiful, but around it, there was a lot of blowdown. There was a lot of trees that were pushed over because the winds were up to 80, 90, 100 miles an hour clocked in Elkhorn. But it's already resprouting. Ferns are popping up, and this is just a short time after the fire. So I just wanted to lead with that and then just jump straight into what we hear a lot of. Active management will solve our fire problem. We heard from Tim. Let's rethink our expectations of firefighters, right? Most people think of firefighters as our heroes, fighting valiantly, bring in the air tankers, put the wet stuff on the red stuff, and put it out. And we have some really unreasonable expectations. And I think parallel to that, there is these unreasonable expectations built up and promoted by the timber industry that we can thin and manipulate vast landscapes and control fire behavior. So it's a parallel message. Firefighting and cutting vegetation will get us to a fire-safe place. And so they argue that they're mimicking natural processes by clear cutting. That's similar to a patch created by a fire. Or they say that they can thin, it's all about active management, which is a euphemism. So I'm going to dive into that. And here's Congressman Bruce Westerman.
Healthy.
Whoopsie. Let me do that again.
Our forests are overstocked, underutilized, and unhealthy.
Underutilized and unhealthy. So the prescription is thin the forests, reduce fire risks. But when you understand, as probably many of you all do, because you go out into our vast areas of forested landscapes, when you understand the vastness of them, you understand how challenging it is to actually affect that. So Dr. Tanya Schneegel went out and looked at thinning projects across the West and found that the odds that a thin patch would burn were less than 1%. Because you have 350 million acres of forest land, you might thin that patch. Depending on the type, it might grow back in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or it might grow back in 20. But it's just a shot in the dark. It's, as Tanya has said to us, it's like trying to take a cup and make the ocean less wet. So let's expand out from there and look at California. In California, in 2017, there was 4 fires, 0.04% of the fires that did 91% of the damage. Those were wind and drought-driven wildfires. And while the rest of them did a small percentage. Same in 2018, 5 fires did 99% of the damage. It's these big wind and drought-driven events that are really the big deals and that we have to prepare for. And really what it starts to tell you as you look at all these other different facts, whether it's the low probability that a thin patch will burn or what is causing most of the structure loss, you see that it's not vegetation that is the predominant factor. So in California, as of September 8, 2020, look at this. What burned? Well, if you were just going to do the raking and the thinning, you would only be affecting 36% of the vegetation types that burned, 36% of the landscape. In Washington State this year, the town of Malden burned to the ground because of a power line went down. And this was just slightly in time ahead of what happened to us. It was in eastern Washington. And look at the trees. They're almost all green. The patterns of destruction do not indicate that a wildfire or a forest fire moved through here, as Tim said, with a tsunami of flames or a wall of flames. It was really an ember-driven wildfire that was ignited by a power line. But in Washington, look, 9.7% of the landscape that burned was forest. Again, telling us something that by focusing on the forest and the cutting, you're not going to get a solution that's going to protect homes and communities. That's not to say that no cutting within near homes or communities is off the table. Of course, there's some things that can make some sense to do, but broadly across the landscape, no. Now, post-fire, there's a lot of demonization, as you heard from Congressman Walden, that it's all destroyed and we just need to get in there and cut and replant. Well, the science tells us a number of things that are quite concerning, particularly if we get our drinking water from these landscapes, as is the case for the city of Eugene within the Holiday Farm fire. That's largely their drinking water source area. And it's also the uplands are what is impacting the river. And post-fire, the sediment levels will go up. But if you log it, they will go up by 22, a multiple of 22x, 22 times greater in paired watershed studies. They also say, the scientists at OSU elsewhere, University of Washington, say that post-fire logging is a tax on ecological recovery. So even if your goal is to grow trees for profit, that it's probably not a good idea because of the impact on the soils, right? About an inch of soil takes about 100 years to develop. So you have to be very careful with what you do. These are some aerial images of post-fire logging in California. And in the Holiday Farm fire, and Tim has some other similar maps that Madeline has made that are excellent. I pulled this one. This shows the extent of private land. So if we think management or cutting or road building would have changed outcomes, well, that's pretty much what dominates within the Holiday Farm fire perimeter. And you should look for a story coming out quite soon from the Oregonian looking at this question. I think it's going to be quite revealing from the air. But just bringing it back to what Tim was showing some other things, that these are climate influenced events, drought and wind. So here we have nationwide numbers going back to the 1920s. And Tim earlier showed you a graph that showed west-wide numbers. But you have a very clear signature of a cool, wet climate period that coincided with the advent of fire suppression, making it look like it really was working. And as that has stopped working, they have tried to up the ante by saying, okay, let's thin now. Let's try to manipulate the landscape and get the outcomes we want. But clearly these events in Oregon, in my mind, and I think in most of the experts' minds that I've interacted with over the last 3 years really intensely on this film that I've been making, have laid bare the fallacy of those notions. So let's take a look at California.
Every passing day now, the toll from California's deadly wildfires grows.
A fire tornado exploded in the middle of what was already a gigantic, devastating wildfire.
We were given an evacuation notice about 6 in the morning. It was so hot and so fast. They just had to let it go.
They just had to let it go. And that was the case in Detroit, Adana. They just had to flee. That was the case in Gates. My friend had 20 minutes notice, woke up his mom, got some stuff out of the safe, and fled town with everybody else, including the wildfire command team, whose command center burned to the ground because a power line ignited. So this is in Paradise. This was a power line ignition. This fire moved into Paradise in less than 3 hours. Wind-driven wildfire, a precursor for what we just experienced in Oregon. This is the post-fire landscape. And what we were told by the firefighters who we visited with to make a film about fire in the West was they would have needed every fire truck, every firefighter from all of California in Paradise within an hour and a half to save 25% of the homes. That's impossible. That's never going to happen. So I just bring this back up because what is the solution to the wind-driven embers that Tim talked about? Let's visit with Dr. Jack Cohen.
From a high-intensity wildfire, we get millions of firebrands being lofted down to expose the whole breadth of those kinds of neighborhoods simultaneously.
So what you see there is a test facility run by the insurance industry in South Carolina where they build duplexes, throw embers at them, and see how they perform. One half of the duplex is fire hardened. We have a code in Oregon. They have a code in California. They have a code in Colorado. In some places, it's mandatory. In Oregon, it's not for new construction. They consider doing that. The home side on the left ignites within just a short period of time, and the other one barely burns before the other side is almost burned to the ground. Ember-proof vents, rain gutter guards, keep the embers out, double pane windows or shutters on your windows. And if you can do it, and you can maintain the water pressure, a sprinkler for your roof, get it wet. But you also probably need the community to be enough well resources to also have more than 2 tenders on hand, which is all they had in Gates, Oregon, when it was burning to the ground. So in Gates, Oregon, I visited a friend of mine there, and this is the command center. This is moments before.
Pulled up by Middle Park, just right outside of Gates. The entire south side of the mountain is on fire. That's the part of the fire that we're going to that in New Spark. 31 to 165, I think that's a New Spark, and 31, I need 3 units up to Gates. Code 3. Okay. Gates Elementary School, and hook up with Fire Incident Command there.
So they went to Gates Incident Command. That's the sheriff's audio that I pulled from this website where you can pull all audio. The sheriff went to the incident command for the fire team that was working the Beachy fire 15 miles away. And they got there, and a power line had hit this cyclone fence in this picture, ignited the grass, and burned the entire incident command post to the ground. So the elite firefighters command team had to also flee town at the same time. I talked to the incident commander last week for an hour on Friday, and he told me as he left town, there was ignitions all over town. Now the timber industry, some people, and PacifiCorp are going to try to blame it on the wilderness fire that was burning in Beachy, which did burn down into Opal Creek and Elkhorn. But simultaneously, because they did not shut the power, there was also a fire, the Archie Creek fire in the Umpqua. Because they did not shut the power in Blue River and Vida, there was a fire in the McKenzie River drainage. Because they did not shut the power at the Oregon coast, there was fires at the Oregon coast. Because they did not shut the power, even though they knew that there was a red flag warning, the power companies burned up a lot of Oregon. That's who's responsible. The wind pushed it. And there's a report to the Wildfire Council, the Oregon Wildfire Council, to which I attended most of the meetings, that said forest fires are 1/10 the size of power line ignited fires. The reason is because power lines ignite fires in wind conditions. That's why. Simple. So what can you do? Well, there's a lot you can do, but really think of it as the sort of the 20/80 rule, or the 80/20 rule. So most of the things that you do, the few things you can do, take care of 80% of your problem. You don't need a metal roof. If you have an asphalt roof, good enough. You just got to keep the litter off of it. You just got to keep the embers out of your house. You don't have to clear more than really 60 feet or 100 feet from your house. An ignited tree does not generate enough heat to ignite the house. Okay, it's the houses, once they're ignited, that typically ignite other houses. That's what happened in Paradise. So you just got to make sure that your home is hardened and that everybody else in your community's homes are hardened. Because even if your home is hardened and then the neighbor's home ignites, then that might ignite your home. But we can do this, and this is up for consideration. Senator Kamala Harris has really been one of the leaders on this. I think a lot of people don't know this. Senator Wyden is now a co-sponsor of the Wildfire Defense Act, and more are signing on. But it's basically improve evac for first responders, address vulnerable populations, harden critical infrastructure and homes, do defensible space work, that kind of thing. There are other bills. Kamala Harris, I put in the good side. Then there's the one that Tim mentioned, Prescribed Fire Act, which is trying to put more fire back on the land. That needs some work, and Tim will be working on that to try to improve that. And then there's just kind of some interesting, concepts. The 21st Century CCC bill by Senator Wyden. If you look at this, it's $5.5 billion for thinning and fuels reduction, and only $100 million for Firewise. So a lot of advocates have been saying flip-flop that, put more money into protecting homes and communities, and we're not really so sure that this thinning expenditure and that we have enough money for all of the above strategies. You really need to focus from the home out, not the forest in. And then, of course, there's the red, and the red is efforts to eliminate environmental law and allow projects and logging projects. That's supported by Senator Daines from Montana and Feinstein from California. And then in Oregon, there was a bill last year that didn't make it out because of the walkout. It had a lot of good things: mapping for where we put homes in the future, land use, very important. There was an effort to try to make the home hardening mandatory. That didn't go through. Realtors, home builders opposed it. Really not a good look for them if people knew it. But those were the kinds of things we're tracking. And really, what's going to come up in the next session is 1536 reconstituted, but what doesn't cost us any money. So the question will be, will there be money from the federal level to support what Oregon needs to prepare for the next fire? And I just wanted to mention last, carbon and climate. How much carbon was released in a big fire? Well, about 10%. And if it's not logged, that landscape with the soil profiles that we have and the wet climate, they pretty much recapture that carbon in 10 to 20 years after, something maybe a little bit longer, 30 years. There's been studies done in Warner Creek out of Eugene. But if they're logged, then they lose a lot more carbon. They go down to about half the amount of carbon they had if they're post-fire logged. So while fire looks like a lot is lost, most of the carbon is standing in the dead trees there that survived. It's still all in the soil. It's the fine material that burns off. So that's another important thing to understand. And really, another way to look at this is what you hear industry say is a young tree, it's uptaking carbon at a faster rate, but it's not the rate at which the tree uptakes carbon. It's the mass balance over time that matters. So if you have an industrial landscape with very small trees, you have at about 111 tons per acre. And if you have an old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, you have 323 tons per acre. So there's a huge potential in these burned over landscapes in the McKinsey drainage to do carbon storage, to bring them back to the condition that they were, so they will accept more fire, like Tim was talking about, and to make up this carbon debt. So I will stop there with the screen and stop the screen share and open it up for questions, Courtney.
Great. Thank you both so much, Tim and Ralph, for your presentations. Thanks for everyone who's participating in the chat, sharing information, asking great questions. Folks, I'm going to start with a few questions. We can stay on. We were going to try to wrap by 8, but we can stay on the Zoom a little longer if we want to stay on for questions. So please feel free to drop off if you need to go at 8. But I believe that Ralph and Tim can stay a little bit longer to answer a few questions if we need to. So lots of great questions here. I'm thinking maybe we could start with a couple of questions about what we know about the severity of the recent fires. Ralph, you showed us a bunch of great videos of that. And just kind of wondering if we know how the older trees did in some of those burns as compared to some of the newer stands. That was a question from Russ.
Yes. So after tonight, we'll send out some resources to everybody who signed up, including some links where you can view images through a flyover and see for yourself. Up around Brighton Bush, it's very much a mosaic burn. Up around Opal Creek, there's significant patches where it was either crowned out, so you see black sticks, or you see browned out, which means that it burned the trees, but the cone and the seed source is still there. And then around Jawbone, there's some mosaic. So that for Beachy and that kind of area, we know really well. In the Holiday Farm Fire, where these industrial tree plantations were, if they were 15 years old, it just looks like a stump field now, and it's just incinerated. There's nothing left. Down in the Umpqua, in the North Umpqua, it's very stark. It's very hard to see, even for someone like myself who appreciates burned landscapes for what they offer. It's been quite hard. I have videos from there sent to me from some people that live down there and who lost everything. And so, and there's folks in Elkhorn who I know who their entire property, there's not a green tree left on it, and that kind of thing. So it was intense, and there was a lot of stand replacing fire. A lot of trees were killed. So a lot of what we know was lost as we knew it.
Thanks, Ralph. And then do we know whether the Forest Service dropped any fire monitoring cones in September to monitor what the severity of those burns were?
I haven't looked through all the burned area emergency recovery reports yet, but I do have them. And there is fire severity data, fire severity mapping in there. And so they've already started producing those maps. So if you're interested in those, you can shoot me an email and I can get you those if you want to go that deep. Now, it's interesting just to note that when you see fire severity maps, that they don't necessarily equate to whether the trees are killed. They equate more to the severity of the soil. And you have like moderate, low, moderate, and high soil burn severity. But those maps all have been produced pretty much for all the fires so far.
And I have to say, I apologize, but I'm still very engaged with the ongoing suppression actions in California, Colorado. So I haven't really circled back to look at severity and mortality in Oregon fires, but just going through some of the Holiday Farm Fire, it looked like a lot of high mortality there. Trees, big and small. With over 70% of that Holiday Farm Fire, that's 140,000 acres or more, whatever, industrial timber plantations, they're all just toast. And the difference between a burned native forest and a burned timber plantation is burned native forests still have the big trees. As snags and logs are prime habitat structures. They play a lot of ecological functions. If you don't disturb the soil further by slamming trees on them and dragging them across steep slopes, the seedbed is still alive there. And as Ralph's images show, things will come back fairly quickly. With an industrial timber plantation, though, they've already taken all the biological legacy. What seedbed might be there is most likely invasive weeds, and because they've poisoned everything beforehand. It's just total loss. There's just nothing there, and to grow a forest or a tree farm there again is complete investment in resources and money and time. So, unlike the native forests that are fully capable of recovering and being rejuvenated on their own. So in the holiday farm fire, it's going to be dramatic, the change in all the dead trees and all the hills, as far as I can see, in the industrial timber plantations. I don't know what they're going to do with those. Most of those are not even merchantable as salvage saw logs. I don't know. This is a question.
Thanks, Tim. And that's actually a great segue into a few questions we got about kind of managing fire in different forest types. And so one question we got from Heather was, where we see in Western Oregon a lot of industrial tree plantations kind of interspersed with more wildlands, and it kind of almost creates another WUI, another interface in a way, where you have this kind of industrial tree plantation next to wildlands. So how do we factor those in when we're talking about protecting the backcountry wildlands, when we know we have all these industrial tree plantations kind of intermixed?
You want me to take that off? Yeah, I think this fire season may be almost analogous to the big blow up of 1910, in which we really, committed to this war on wildfire, because the whole premise of industrial agricultural timber plantations are predicated on fire exclusion, because timber plantations are so flammable, so vulnerable to catastrophic burning. You got to keep all fires far away. And in climate change, and with accidents and arsonists and power lines, everything, we know that's just not possible to prevent and exclude all fires for decades on end till those trees can grow tall enough to be cut down. So, and in fact, they premised it is clear cutting was mimicking stand replacing fire. And their claims to sustainability is this: okay, we'll mimic stand replacing fires and keep out all stand replacing fires. And so that's why, as Courtney, your question is, we've got these timber plantations, in some cases interspersed with the fragments of native forests left behind from the heyday of clear-cut old growth logging. And those plantations put at risk those native forests, those fragments, the beauty strip along Mackenzie Highway. A lot of that got killed. And when they take those trees down for hazard trees or salvage timber or whatever, you're going to be seeing a lot more of that Mackenzie River and a lot more of those industrial clear-cut plantations. So industries, kind of had a subsidy in case of fire. Uncle Sam's firefighting army will defend your land. And it allowed them to stock up the ground with as many stems per acre as they could possibly do to, yield bigger profits. I don't think they're going to be able to do it like that moving forward. They're going to have to, design their plantations in very different ways. They're going to have to maybe plant more widely, less yield, but maybe more survivability of the trees. They're going to have to put more fuel breaks on their land instead of us having to put those impacts on public lands. And so, we're going to have to kind of renegotiate here how, if at all possible, you continue this kind of industrial agricultural model of tree farming as it has been done in the past, how you can do that given climate change and given climate fires. So that's my answer.
And I just say something that struck me in a presentation I listened to last night with Margot Robbins from the Yurok tribe, who said that a lot of the places that were former prairie and oak woodlands have now been planted in Douglas fir. And so it's really hard for them to get fire back on the land, but it's also, gotten rid of those natural fuel breaks and the patchiness of the landscape that was there before.
Mhm.
Great. Well, that's a great segue to Ralph into a question from Christopher in talking about Margot's work and getting prescribed fire back on the land. Is there a role for prescribed fire in the wildland urban interface, especially when you have these strong agency disincentives for using fire as a management tool, like potential liability issues? So I think a lot of folks are interested, and there's other questions we're getting too about, what is the role for prescribed fire and how do we make decisions about where that's the appropriate tool to be used?
Yeah. Tim and I were talking about this the other day, and I would just, if you want to go deep, there's this book that it's Native Peoples in the Natural Landscape. And it really talks about all the different landscapes, right? Because it's hard for a person to hold multiple ideas in their head at the same time. And we're told that there's a lot of fire suppression and that's a problem and we need to get fire back on the land. Well, that's not so true as having an impact in our wet West Cascade forests that are very dense, right? But it's true maybe in other landscapes. In some landscapes, there was a lot more fire use, indigenous fire use, prescribed fire over generations, millennia. In some, it's not appropriate. But in general, in drier types, it's really promoted in Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon at lower elevations. A person from the Nez Perce was telling me that, not at higher elevations in wet, cold, moist forests. But Tim really, he's got a lot of relationships with the Karuk and the Yurok and various tribes and people that are trying to get fire back on the land and prescribe fire, not in the form of piling and burning post-logging, but prescribed fire burning the fine material. So I think it can be a really good tool, is what I've learned, if applied in the right places and if supported. But there are a lot of challenges, as noted by the questioner, in terms of getting that to scale because of the risks and liability and the smoke that it produces. But some folks say, how do you want your smoke? Do you want it in smaller doses, or do you want it in these big events that get what we just got? I'm not sure we're entirely in control of that. I mean, and I'm not sure I agree with that, the premise that we actually get to decide. I think that's part of the problem. But I do think that there's, that has been proven, and that thinning and then burning and doing burning is really what's needed to be able to get, to some extent, create more defensible space and make us safer in our homes and communities. So Tim, I would offer that and ask you to add or whatever, correct me.
Yeah. Well, again, the Kalapuya survived for 10,000 years in a fire-prone environment without any engines or air tankers or any of that. By, carefully burning buffer areas around their villages, around, the areas that burn to travel, transportation corridors and all that. And it's really the small diameter surface fuels. That's what really carries fire. An ember lands at a treetop and it goes out. Ember lands on the forest floor full of dead needles and limbs and grasses, and it can whip up. So there is a role for prescribed fire. It has so many constraints, though, from financial or regulatory, the smoke issue, whatever. What's happening now, by wink, wink, nod, nod, is that many fire managers are managing wildfires like prescribed fires. They can't be out there explicit about that, but we have a great fire policy that allows us many options. And so if you've got a big wildfire, one section's headed towards town, we'll concentrate fire crews there, stop its spread if we can. But if it's burning up, upslope into high country or wilderness area, and it actually benefits from fire, we can just kind of monitor it. In the future, we'll be seeing more fire lighters, less firefighters, and the function will be more steering fires than stopping. And we'll be starting a lot of fires. starting more than stopping. We'll really be, envision a day when we don't have the term firefighters anymore. It'll be anachronistic. We'll be something different. Call them fire rangers, if you will. And they're out there doing land stewardship, working with fire instead of fighting against it. And particularly in those ecosystems that are like dry interior forests that had frequent fires that have really been impacted by even a few decades of successful fire suppression. They've missed a lot of fires that would have whittled down some of those, mats of dead needles and limbs and things. So in our western Cascadia forests, the role of fire is a little bit ambiguous, but we could still employ it right on our borders of our communities as buffers from any kind of wildfires. We can't really get there until we deal with the homes first, though. Make them so they're not prone to ignition from the tiniest ember or the smallest little surface flame. So it's really starting when the homes and communities are working out that we will increase our ability to work with fire on the land.
That's great. Thanks, Tim. That's that also answers some other questions and comments people had put in the chat about kind of the language that we're using and, the idea of firefighting versus moving to some new paradigm. There was also a kind of related question around messaging from Joy about, talking about the difference between these kind of urban fires and wildfires and what kind of terms should we be using when we talk about that difference. So I think people are definitely interested in kind of the language we're using, the messaging that we're sending to kind of be clear about, really what's happening and be more kind of specific with our language. So do you have a word that you're using when you're talking about fires once they've moved more into the urban areas and not calling them wildfires anymore?
Well, I call them wooey fires, but that's kind of inside baseball. You have to know what wooey is. And even that concept, the wildland urban interface, is still pretty broad as particularly agencies that define it. And in some cases, they define the entire national forest as part of the WUI because a fire 30 miles away could eventually spread to a town. That's just too nebulous, ambiguous, vast. The home ignition zone, as Ralph was talking about, much more precise, focused. And that's where the intersect of the prime, where the two lines intersect of prime fire hazard and prime social values. Our homes are destroyed by fire. Some remote mountaintop in a wilderness area in a fire adapted ecosystem benefits from fire. So why are we sending crews chasing fires all over the land, when really, where's our highest values and most risk of fire? And that is concentrated near homes and communities.
Yeah. I mean, really what you saw like in Gates was a structure to structure fire. You saw structure fires and structures igniting other structures. And what's really interesting about that one is it's called the Beachy Fire. And there was a press release on September 9th where they were like, we need to rename this the Santiam Canyon Fires because it was ignited by 12, power line ignitions. But now it's still called the Beachy Fire. They went back to that. So it's very confused. And then the Archie Fire is not called PacifiCorp's transmission line to California fire. That's what it should be, PacifiCorp's transmission line fire. I mean, that was the ignition source. So maybe it should be named that way, or at least it should be referred to that way. One thing I just wanted to pause to acknowledge is, one, it's wonderful to see all the people participating, including Dr. Lisa Ellsworth Johnson, hello, who has done amazing work on trying to documenting carbon cycles in forests, like in Warner Creek that I mentioned earlier. And a lot of the information that I brought to bear, I've learned from Tim. I've just tried to slightly improve upon the wheel of the people who've come before me that exist out there, and also try to bring it to you visually. But I've spent time with Dr. Jack Cohen's material. He's the home expert. He's the one who says, don't focus on the wildlands. Focusing more than 60 feet from the home is a waste of time. Focus on the ignitability of your home. Solve that problem, and you can live in fire-prone landscapes with a good degree of comfort, right? And then, just some of the other experts, the wildlife folks who say, not all wildlife is killed, right? In fact, most of them in the Western US know what to do. They fly away if they're birds. They go underground if they're wildlife that are small, or they run, and they can run pretty fast, and they can run quite a bit faster than even a really fast wind-driven wildfire, which, I think the experts are saying, Tim, maybe you know about this, but what I've read is that a lot of people want to know about the wildlife. So I mention this because some of the experts that I've read and some of the information that Lisa has sent to me suggests that even in a 50-mile-an-hour windstorm fire, that the ground-based movement of that fire is about 10% of that. Maybe it's more. So the bears and the deer and the elk can go 20, 25 miles an hour if they need to and run for some water, hopefully. And so we hope, and what we found in Eagle Creek Fire was a lot of wildlife. I hope I'll find a bunch in Elkhorn. I saw some questions about the water in Elkhorn. The water seems very clear up there from the 2 times I've been up there. And it's really an undisturbed landscape logging wise up in those drainages. So hopefully that'll maintain, right? And we hope to find a lot of wildlife out there. But really a lot of the stuff that I've shared and that we'll share after, we have some of the best experts in the world on this at Oregon State University, and they've really figured a lot of this stuff out. It's not as well known. I really also want to say that the reporting at the Oregonian and OPB and other outlets has really improved. I think that you'll start to see the media more saying focus on the home, like the LA Times is saying that it's, these kinds of things. So around this language, it's a collective effort by the media, by all of us, to say to our leaders, we need you to focus on the solutions that work, right? And prioritize our resources, because we don't have resources to do everything, on the things that work. And so that's what I was trying to share with you tonight, is to help you understand both what has happened, what you're likely to see out there, but also how we can play a role in telling the leaders, the people that are deciding how to spend all of our money, on what we can do going forward. Because my friend in Gates that lost 4 homes, they're like, Ralph, I'd rebuild, but are the power companies going to shut the power off next time? And I'd rebuild, but I want to know that everyone else around me is going to harden their homes. Now that I know this, I wish I'd known it before, but now that I know this, that's what I want to know before I rebuild. So that's what's driving me to deliver this message to you, the experts, the people on the ground that are affected. So I hope that's answers some of your additional questions that I've seen in the chat.
Thanks, Ralph. I do want to ask a question about kind of that gathers some of the multiple questions about kind of mitigation and other efforts going forward. And then if we have time, there were several questions about salvage logging. And so I think it would be great to hear your thoughts on that as well. But first, just looking at clearly the causes of these fires was kind of this overlay of climate change and then these other human causes, power lines. So kind of thinking about what are the other measures to reduce the kind of accidental human ignition. So again, not talking about prescribed fire now, but should we be preparing to bury our electric lines? Liz asks. Karen's asking, should there be a new land use goal that addresses, building in the wildland urban interface and defining what that is and limiting that? Are there other things beyond the kind of home hardening specifics that, for someone who lives in an area completely surrounded by forests, as Bob asks, what are the things that we can do? Is there any land management that matters there, or is it all really just focusing on hardening your home? So maybe just a couple of quick rundowns to some of those ideas and thinking about moving forward. Again, the kind of what are the policies we should be pushing for to kind of mitigate this going forward?
Mm-hmm. I guess I would just say, I talked to a friend in Elkhorn, and the power company is going to bury all the lines in Elkhorn. And she was thrilled about that. Holding the power companies responsible to shut down the power in red flag conditions, they did it on Mount Hood. They're required to do it in California. They're required to report any power line ignitions within 24 hours in California. Red flag conditions is 35-mile-an-hour winds and drought conditions. That's what red flag is. Everybody knows it. I've heard through a source that the night before these fires happened, that PacifiCorp had a meeting very much about this very subject, but then did not act. I have not been able to verify that. So they knew. The meteorologist warned them. I mean, I shared out to my friends 2 days before these fires that a red flag condition was coming. And because I'd spent, a lot of time with footage from California, I knew what that meant. We now know what that means, I think, and that needs to be well known. And if we can avoid power line ignitions, we can avoid a lot of loss in the future. But 9 out of 10 fires are started by people, whether it's a trailer, a chain on a trailer hitch throwing sparks and igniting a grass fire, or a teenager being foolish, or what is it, Tim? 50% of human-caused ignitions are on the 4th of July.
It's the most ignition-prone day of the year, for sure. Yeah.
So that's a big part of it. Dealing with power line ignitions, definitely, I believe that I will expect to see something at the federal level. There's a lot of regulation at the federal and state level that limits what can be done. So I'd expect money to be put towards burying power lines and that kind of thing, Courtney. I see Russ, and Russ is nodding his head yes. Russ has been talking to some folks on that score and knows something about that.
What about land use zoning in the WUI?
Definitely. I mean, Thousand Friends of Oregon, where Russ Hoflick is the executive director, and our good friend Mary Kyle McCurdy works there. They've been asking for and pushing for wildfire hazard mapping, which would then relate to land use and guide, hopefully, future land use planning and where development would occur or not occur. And then also, I think that there's strong interest in home hardening code for existing construction potentially, but definitely for new construction. But there's a concern there by saying you can harden your home, that those that want to build anywhere would then just build anywhere. I think it still needs to be coupled with, it's still a risk even if you harden your home. So hopefully that answers that. Russ is shaking his head yes, so I did well, I think.
If I can add, there's been kind of a quiet revolution within the wildland fire community, a kind of sudden revelation that, the real urgent need is not managing fire in the land, it's managing people and fire in the land. And those who got into the fire world just from the forestry degree at some state university and didn't take a lick of sociology are now kind of feeling, wow, I missed something there. So, Professor John Bailey of OSU recently expressed frustration. People want to attribute one thing. It's all climate change, or it's all forest management, or it's all rural sprawl. That's just one thing causing these wildfires becoming disastrous. Well, they all are intersecting. But those problems were decades or centuries in the making. We're going to be dealing with climate change for generations henceforth. We're going to be dealing with over a century of fire exclusion, decades of fire suppression for a long time ahead. We're going to be dealing with our settlement and development patterns, for a long time. What we can change in the near time, short term, is our own behavior. And that behavior means how people live in their homes and in their communities in fire-prone environments. We can change our behaviors, change a little bit of our aesthetic, perhaps. And then what are land stewards? How are they interacting with that? What are fire crews doing? Are they still fighting off fires, or are they lighting more fires, or changing our strategies and tactics for how we relate to fire in the land? It's all about our own behavior that we can control far better and here and now, more than this quest to control nature. That, again, damned if we lose, damned if we win in that quest to conquer or control nature. But our own behavior, that's where you should start. And you see some measurable success in living more safely and sustainably with these fire-prone environments.
Man, I love how Tim Ingalsbee can sling the metaphors like nobody's business. He can use the metaphors just like I can use the visuals. Really, really appreciate you, Tim, and your and he's. I would just encourage everybody who has not ever checked out Fusey to go to their website, and if you liked some of those metaphors, you will find more. You can find a collection of music and albums about fire. Yeah. Tim is is it savant, or Anyway, you really have taken it to a whole nother level, and it's really it's something special. But I also want to say that again, Lisa Ellsworth Johnson in the chat, what did she say to us? For those of you that are worried and are thinking that we might have had an event that looks like Australia, where you see a bunch of harmed animals, that happened in Australia for different reasons, because it's a different ecosystem with animals that are not adapted to fire. What Lisa says in the chat, there will be occasional direct mortalities. In other words, some critters will die, but the vast majority of wildlife will escape the fire. I think that's pretty good news for the night. I would celebrate that most of the wildlife out there is not being killed by the negligent power company fires, or, the Beachy Creek fire that also blew up. So anyway, thank you for that, Lisa. Appreciate it very much. Courtney, do you have another one for us?
Yeah, I have one more, and I just want to remind folks there were some questions about sharing resources. So as Ralph said, we're going to share resources out with everyone who registered for this webinar. So there'll be lots of helpful information that you'll see again afterwards. So for those of you who are looking for things about helping to share information with people who are living in the WUI and thinking about how to message these issues and learning more about the impacts, Ralph and Tim are going to be sharing a lot of information after this as well. So just turning, I think, for a last topic, from protecting our communities from these fires to kind of protecting these burned landscapes. There were several questions about, Leslie said, we're already seeing tree cutting happening in the Santiam Canyon. Lucy says on the Gifford Pinchot, we already see the timber industry calling for the post-fire logging and the Big Hollow fire. So Wendy's asking, what can we expect? And, how can we push back and protect on the state and federal level to protect these burned forests from logging when we know that industry is successful in communicating that burned forests have less ecological worth or have less economic worth? So what do you think we can do to kind of push back?
Well, we're looking at that at the Crag Law Center with some of our conservation clients as to where the threats are, that they are going to be potentially going after the older forests that burned, but there's still value in the burned trees. The younger ones, probably it's going to be a very short window before they're no longer valuable. Along the roadside, it's really hard to see. It's really hard to do anything about it because of safety. Up on the way to Elkhorn, for example, there's all these beautiful hardwood forests. They're all marked, and they don't need probably all to be marked because some of them are already resprouting. What I saw in the gorge was the hardwoods resprouted. I talked to some folks in Elkhorn today to help them develop a plan to try to get them remarked and rechecked and wait and not go in there and knock everything down quickly. Down in the Umpqua, it's heartbreaking to see the width of the corridor they've put along these power lines. It's really hard. But we have a lot of threats that we're going to be able to do something about. We will be using the law, and that will be things like challenging attempts to do multiple projects, but split them up into smaller projects that we are hearing might emerge in the Mount Hood National Forest on the Riverside Fire and or the White River Fire. We are hearing, like up around Brightonbush, they're just going to leave it alone and close the area so that they don't have to go in there and do a bunch of cutting for safety around the cabin area. Every cabin but one burned to the ground. And so I think most of the folks that had cabins up there appreciate that they are fine to stay out of the area and just let it do its own thing. And that's what I saw on the Eagle Creek fire that worked is if we weren't desperate to get in there, that there was less impact on the landscape that we loved, right? They didn't have to cut everything down for our safety to get in there. And I think that's going to have to be the case at Opal because there's massive blowdown and there's a lot of trees that will come down. But my experience in burn landscapes is I haven't had one time I've had a tree fall near me, but when it was thundering, it was thunderous and it scared the daylights out of me. But otherwise, I've spent countless hours in them and seen nothing. And I think that our best thing is to just sort of encourage letting them come back slowly, but we will have to challenge them for the impacts on wildlife. We will probably need to figure out collectively as a community, I'm not saying what Crag is going to do, but staff up, have more resources to challenge some things and be ready to go pretty quickly. But I mean, I think a lot of what the outcomes might be could be determined next week, and they will be determined in the next 18 months, right, Tim? That's the value window for most of these trees. If we can hold them off for 18 months, then there will be no value for them to get out of it. It's really would be more of a safety thing. Does that sound about right to you, Tim?
It depends about the size and the species and all that. They decay at different rates and they have different commercial values. But I do just thinking in terms of holiday farm fire, I do fear because so much the beauty strip along the highway burned pretty hot, or didn't burn so hot, but it did kill the trees. A lot of the trees, fragments, patches of the native forest left behind. And industry lost big time. They lost decades of their investments in timber plantations. And how they're going to make up for that loss? They're going to be lusting after public lands in a major way. And so, so we have to be wary. And there's a thing that it's an assumption that a tree that's burned up and killed, all its carbon lost in the sky instantaneously. That's just not true. It can hold the carbon, the biomass, for decades, for centuries in some cases. Nothing like charcoal. It's like meal. It locks it in for a long time. And while we got these big snags and logs with their carbon kind of locked in and slowly releasing it over time, you got the new understory plants and the next generation trees rapidly growing, sequestering carbon. So you've got kind of double the load there between the carbon that's locked into dead trees and the carbon that's being sequestered by the young trees. So the worst thing you can do is cut down the big trees, drag them across the slope, export all that carbon, liquidate that carbon, you should say, and destroy the next generation of forests coming up. The worst thing. Post-fire salvage logging, the most destructive form of logging there isn't one ecologically beneficial aspect to it. It's purely about profit. And by salvaging trees, we're literally scuttling the forest. And so, there's going to be issues with those hazard trees. Along the roadside, dead trees fall and could cause hazards. But, I'll tell you what, once you fall on a dead tree, that ends its falling hazard right there. As a log, it's not going to hit anyone. That may not be realistic, but let's make sure that those roadside hazards are actually roads that people will be driving on. And our forests are full of thousands and thousands of miles of old logging roads that no one will ever travel. They've been degrading for decades. To use that as a pretense, it could be a potential falling hazard. Well, no. I mean, to log every tree within what's left behind from those old logging roads would be very destructive. So we're going to have to figure it all out. But
I think the other piece I would just say, Courtney, is that there's the law, there's the scientific understanding of what the value is and what we would lose. I think just the big picture message should be: we've already lost so much of the places we love. Let's not do any more damage. And so I think that's the kind of we can't afford to lose any more. We need to keep all the seed sources. We need to keep all the carbon on the landscape. So I think that the collective effort of all of us that have tuned in tonight, and the conservation groups that we support, and the firefighter advocates that are advocating for sanity with firefighting, and everyone needs to just echo that message that it's really important to preserve what is left out there, and that includes the charcoal forests, and for their values, and really try to show that to people what that value is in very beautiful ways. I think will also help with that effort.
Thank you both so much. I think, understanding what we're dealing with is half the battle, right? So grateful for both of your time and helping explain this to us. Tim, Ralph, for those of you new to Crag, learn more about our work at crag.org and our upcoming first ever virtual gala, Wild Shots, December 4th, where we actually have a reading by Richard Powers, who's the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Overstory. If you haven't read it, it's a novel all about our protecting our forests. So very on point for this presentation. And again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and look out for those resources that Ralph and Tim will be sharing after the presentation. Thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.